For all the negatives that we put on Disney in this day and age, there is always going to be positives to counteract that. Because as we all know, most of the conversations surrounding the company are pointing out their negative failings with how horrible their 100th anniversary has been for the movies and TV department, not looking good for the better and not understanding what got them here in the first place when everyone is seeking for a change. And while even that is true, it still reminds us the reason why Disney still exists to this day in the first place for those positive impacts, where they have had and still do have various works of art that we all actually enjoy. The people who put out their passion in stories all of us actually love and escape in the realm of wonder in the beauty of life. And that's something most of us Disney fans still love to do, like myself, considering how much it can actually offer, as it has done for a complete century. And that of course includes a collection of Disney heroes and villains that we all love that makes the stories complete to what they are, the characters we connect to the most that reflects on our lives in some way. But beyond that, of course, is the side characters that make the world complete alongside it, stuff that actually includes parents for most of our said heroes. Which of course, as you guessed by the main title of this video, is the thing I just wanted to focus on today and appreciate as an underrated element of Disney storytelling. I mean, most in that case except for Buck Cluck in that regard, or probably even these two turds as we'll see later. Because when we actually look back on the massive catalog of movies that Disney has, we always see that our young heroes start their journey off with their own families, mainly in the case of their parents who teach them and raise them to become who they are at the start and end of the very film. Where of course for the most part, and the biggest reason they are underrated for that, is the fact that most of them are actually dead within the first few minutes of the film, either both or just one parent alive. I mean, there are some films that they are still alive for most of the runtime, as we would see later on with films like Strange World and Encanto, which actually explore that family dynamic that we will talk about. But still, instead for most of the other stories in the hero's journey, they are usually separated from our main characters through death or just lost for the most part until the very end. And when you look back on that for the most part of the story, you can't help but to actually appreciate what they actually provide for the films for either good or bad reasons. Mostly in the case of good for how our heroes actually turn up, but also just both good and bad in the ways that they were portrayed that shaped the events of the film in the first half or the entirety of those said movies. That they are the most important part in their life and in our own with what we actually grow and value, either in our own parents or when most of us actually eventually become parents ourselves, reflecting on the best and worst parts in all of us. It's an interesting journey to actually note for the most part when they weren't a large factor starting out with films like Snow White and just having the evil queen as her stepmother to actually start without mentioning any much of her real parents, but also actually got developed over time from there. Ones where Disney started to delve into exploring with Geppetto wishing to be and acting as the father of the wooden puppet Pinocchio, wanting to have his own kid and inspiring him to become a real boy who can grow up and be who he wants. This was the true genesis of Disney having parents involved in their stories and influencing their lives to actually be better. Mainly, of course, as its starting point, when films like Bambi actually did the same with his mother, where it gave us one of the most significant moments in all of animated and film history with the very death of her character, often teaching Bambi about the forest and warning him about the dangers of man. And this is really important to note because of how it gave us her death and teaches kids that concept and connects us with the loss of our own family in any moment of our life. How it truly shapes the journey for the better or worse in this case, and remains to be such a high mark for any story, including that of killing most of the hero's parents off anyway. And you also had that same motherly figure in other films like Dumbo as well, showing how important they are in the child's life, nurturing them before they actually sprout and grow up, just like his ears floating off before they decide to move on to actually full-on human relationships like Cinderella. And in the case of Cinderella, it's kind of the same as the earlier Disney stories, where they weren't much included in the film except for the very beginning, but also a cornerstone for how those like Cinderella actually turned out in their life, especially elaborating on that part in the stepfamily portion that's more about evil and abuse. That it isn't to say all stepfamilies are like this, but that some are actually exploitive except for your real parents who actually did take care of you, just in case of in any type of situation that is actually real. This is again where I like to include the live action film too, and how good it was in expanding that very point. One done in a movie that actually cared about developing its world for the most part compared to most remakes, where they spend more time including both Ella's father and mother and how that actually shaped her life to who she actually is, the character we all fell in love with in both live action and animated versions, how both actually really inspired her to move on in the face of adversity when they both were affected by illnesses that really hurt her and resulted her being cared by Lady Tremaine and her stepsisters as a result, where we see over time she took their love and compassion that they they felt towards her to heart in order to stand strong and make her dreams to actually come true. That she earned that ending to be with the prince because of the actions of her own parents that led to that very moment, and something most of us should remember in terms of both good and bad, with our real family and our step family that could go either way for the parents depending on the type of love and character they actually display. And that character could also be displayed in Peter Pan with the Darlings, and how George actually wanted his daughter and his sons to actually grow up. The reality of life that we have to face when we want to stay young and free forever with the likes of Peter Pan. One that's also cleverly represented by Captain Hook in that same place, who's also voiced by George himself, Hans Conried, representing those who want to grow up or are already grown up and being mature, and keeping them down compared to what Peter wants to stay in the wild, free and young for all time, just like any kid would want. It's where you see across the entire journey Wendy actually getting to the point of maturing, realizing what her father meant that was actually well-intentioned, but just came across as strict and stern for someone who's already experienced growing up. The cycle where you relate to the main hero as a kid, whether it be Peter or Wendy, but then actually become George or Mary in the world when you become a parent yourself. Because even as suggested by some areas of the very film, people like George probably had adventures with Peter in the past when he was actually a little boy, making you relate to that certain place that yearns for both adventure but also just life itself as we actually grow up and understand our place in the world. And speaking in terms of strict parents, this leads us to King Triton himself and an interesting situation compared to most of these previous ones I just talked about. Because when you actually look at The Little Mermaid for the most part, characters like Ariel go on a journey getting what they want and still relatively staying the same, except learning to not make deals with any sea witches at all. Because instead in this story, the change and development actually happens to King Triton himself the most, trying to protect his daughter from what he perceives is dangerous as the human world, and of course just his love for her. This is just such an interesting concept to the story that we know for the most part in our heroes that are actually dead set in what they really want, where it's just the side characters that has to get the change to actually really see that. The lessons we actually usually apply that can happen towards our own parents, opening up to setting their young ones free in the choices they want in their life. It's good to protect them from anything that you can find harmful in life, but it's also better to actually set them free to become who they are and who they actually choose to be. But also coming to understand what his daughter actually wanted and the truth of what his sheltered mind actually prevented him from seeing. Then of course you move on to other films like Beauty and the Beast and Belle's relationship with her own father, Maurice. Here we have a hard-working inventor who seeks to better his and his daughter's life and the world around him with such inventions. His motivations also do come to Belle being such a loving daughter, where both him and Belle are kinda looked down upon by the town as strange. Not harmful in any way, but just finding them weird, attempting at inventing things that are comical and whatnot that would actually never work. Mainly of course by how Gaston has influenced the town to think similar to him. And of course, he is the reason the events of the film actually start off when he goes to present his invention, getting lost and ending up at the Beast's castle due to chasing wolves, where the Beast actually mistakes him for doing something else and captures him until Belle actually decides to willingly take his place, sending him back and of course notifying Gaston and the town of the Beast's existence when they go after him after she comes back and shows them. I mean, in this case, it's just great to see them play back and forth as characters and seeing such a strong relationship they have that are willing to go to protect each other as father and daughter, what they really care about and what the Beast actually sees in that, where the bonds between two are such a powerful form of storytelling when one of the family members are gone from their lives from the very beginning. A case also strengthened by one of Disney's own greatest works in The Lion King itself, where it becomes a key point in the entire story with both Mufasa and Simba, because overall, this is probably one of the most well-known parents and dads in cinema that could have been only played by one of the most iconic voices in cinema in James Earl Jones as a powerful mighty leader of the King of the Pride Lands. How this all ties back into the circle of life and that meaning, and growing and protecting the future generation for those responsibilities that may come for such people that are young and naive, seeking danger before knowing what consequences that actually come with it, and how that actually comes from within family with characters like Scar being his brother and Simba's uncle who just kills him to take the throne and lead for the sake of it. A short-sighted definition of ruling that Simba actually once thought before his father tried to teach him the most important lessons about love and life and nurturing what it truly means to be a king. Because his death is probably one of the most impactful moments in all of Disney history that shapes him to do better at the very end, where despite growing up with Timon and Pumbaa teaching him how to live free in the jungle, he still remained to be the son of that very king whose destiny relies within that circle of life with the balance of nature that must keep going for us to keep thriving. How we can even see in these moments when Mufasa appears long after his death among the stars to Simba to really remember who he is, where our parents actually still live within our own hearts and to an extent our minds, like what he told them all those years ago when they looked up to the stars, where they will always watch over us and guide us even through our own darkest periods in life, ready ready to take her place at the very end, bringing the cycle back to that very beginning when Simba himself takes that mantle to become a very father as well. It has such a beautiful message and imagery when you actually think about it, and a very important landmark to showcase why these characters should exist in the story and what they try to shape. And then you also have fun depictions of mythological figures that are completely inaccurate, like Zeus and Hera being Hercules' parents, loving and caring gods who seek to grow Hercules into a mighty hero one day when he grows up. The best part about Hercules in this situation is that he gets love from both his adopted foster parents and his real parents in the film that were all caused by his own uncle, that both actually allow him to become his own man and find his destiny to go the distance, another trait carried over by other Disney protagonists as we've seen from before at this point, and another point that showcased how they actually influence our heroes in such a positive way, before of course turning back to Tarzan to killing them off in the first part of the movie. Where in that instance, with how small a part they actually really play in the film, is where you actually learn to appreciate how their sacrifice plays into Tarzan becoming the man he was raised in the jungle by gorillas with his big heart. It's where you can agree with the amount of time they were actually given in the story in that part where it shapes him throughout the development. That those bits and pieces that connected him with his past is where he tries to go with Jane a bit later and become a regular man. And of course in the message of the two worlds one family in the opening Phil Collins song. I mean, personally I don't know if there's any been gorillas who's raised humans before because I don't look into that stuff even if it remotely exists, but it also shows this element of people in this world showcased through these gorillas, of people actually willing to care for those who lose their own family at such young ages, and how over time they can learn to accept that, like Kerchak becoming Tarzan's adopted father. At least that's what I see, which is very interesting to do in that very message of two worlds coming together, being a part of the same family. And in talking about those small roles that they actually play, that same small impact of the parents can also be felt in Lilo and Stitch, just having that one picture of Lilo and Nani's actually father and mother who died in an accident before the events of the film, and how that lingers on with those two trying to live on without them, all done within the message of Ohana, which is very important to people like me, and of course you, as that does mean family, and family means nobody gets left behind or forgotten, accepting Stitch in that situation, knowing what they meant to the sisters, where you can really see in cases like this their effect on the story, where if it's done in a complete way, it is very impactful despite their little to no screen time presence in the film. Something that I thought films released later on like Wish actually greatly needed, as characters like Asha's father are just briefly mentioned only twice before that actually went nowhere. Like it is an important point for a character's journey, but sadly with everything else, it had nowhere to go. But if it had it structured around that very story, then maybe it can work. And that is something you can also excuse in that part partially in Atlantis because of Milo's parents also died off screen, and only mentioned his and his grandfather's relationship being explored after they died, taking him in. How they shared their love for searching for the lost city of Atlantis and whatever which he succeeds and tributes to his character closely connected to him, like Whitmore. That overall, with their thread written out as parents, they still had something to go on with a family who takes care and continues such a legacy that his own parents and grandfather would actually be proud of. And also of course, Kito's relationship to her father trying to protect her people and open up from the failures of his own past, what he tried to do that was best for Atlantis that almost destroyed them, and looking to his daughter and hope for something new that would not repeat such mistakes in what most people pass on to our own next generation. But what's even more effective than all of what I discussed is in fact Treasure Planet and the story of Jim Hawkins, because this is where we see a rebellious teen raised by his mother, taking care of this inn and surviving after his father left him, and how that moment actually plays an important role in his life with father figures like John Silver and what he was actually missing, where within those first few minutes of that scene of the film is probably one of the most impactful emotional scenes you can ever really see, something you notice when you see his father decide to leave them out on the boat sailing for whatever adventure is out there that he found more important than his own family. Like this entire scene can play out in so many ways and so many theories to how we actually relate to in our lives and how some people actually act with their own emotions, what they find in their life where they can't bear to take care of children or just tired of their spouses or whatever. Where Jim's dad just leaving up and abandoning his family is a very real thing that many kids actually go through in their life. The relatable moment of being neglected by the very people who did bring you in the world is just very powerful, where to see them pick those pieces up is just truly heart-wrenching, wanting to do better as we see at the very end, and the experiences we get from someone who's in fact the main villain of the story who redeems himself at the end as a better father figure than what he actually had. And that's another point about why Disney parents are so underrated on the negative side, where their consequences still actually impact the characters to develop in ways to be better than their own past. Something that Strange World also tried to do later on, but also not as very good as stories like Treasure Planet did, as we see they are still there as each generation, and something we would see already done greater impact in films like Encanto. But knowing what Treasure Treasure Planet did with the character in such a short impact yet again is just a true testament to how good the story is as a whole and why such elements needed to be appreciated by many. But then again, speaking on the negative side, and the other reason why they are so underrated, is because of a select few like Buck Sucks, a guy known as the worst father in all of animated history, even more worse than what you thought of Jim's dad just leaving him like that in that short scene. Because this is a character that has been covered so many times where it's just not even worth covering here because of how horrible he is to his own son for most of the movie until he admits that he is that terrible father. Where in fact, the only reason I mention him here is just my inspiration for officially making a ranking video later on of Disney parents, where 90% of it will just in fact be dedicated to talking about how horrible and shit he truly is as a parent, and one that set back Disney animation a decade when talking about parents or family in any film. Something that is actually true for some cases, but it still sucks because he is the most stupidest Disney character that has ever existed. And considering that we are discussing our hatred of certain parents in this, I would also like to throw in Agnar and Iduna in this conversation because I really hate them too because of how little they actually have in the story that actually caused the events of the damn movie for the worse, not making it any better in both cases of Frozen and Frozen 2, shutting the kingdom out. I mean, I won't deny their impact on the film and how it plays out and still the message I've tried to send with this entire video, but then again, that entire impact is negative and the sequel just tries to make us think that what they did was positive overall to bridge the two worlds and handing this gift of Elsa having these powers, but then mishandling that very gift with Elsa and causing the mess they did in the first place. Like every action they do is what sets the events off, and the opinions of people like Elsa being sheltered and all of this and all of that, they're the ones who actually caused it in the first place, and I hate that. But then again, I still see the positives of what it turned out for the entire story, so that could actually be excused in some point. Which thus far is the only side of the puzzle that explores something so positive yet so negative in terms of writing, where films like Meet the Robinsons really take those generational gaps together. Because in the beginning of this story, we learned that Louis Robinson's real mother actually left him at the steps of the orphanage. Another one of those relatable situations where birth parents actually give up on their own offspring at the beginning as they can't support them or whatever problems they have as an individual. That this leads us into the events of the film that makes Louis inspired to become an inventor and trying to woo any potential adopted parent, where it also doesn't work since most actually fail to impress. And as a result in the film, it encourages him to find his real mother to change history to stop her from giving someone up like him, something that we know his own son actually does in a way to keep him on that same path and stopping the bowler hat guy, his own roommate Mike Yagubian, who turns evil in the future, who tries to actually ruin that. And in that journey, we learn how great Wilbur's family is, which is actually Louis's future family, without even knowing that of his birth mother, what legacy he would build specifically, and that steps he would take under the slogan of keep moving forward, which Walt Disney said a long time ago, speaking of Imagineering and finding new ways to develop technology like Louis actually did in the entire film. That we learn here, and especially at the end of the film, that the family he found through his own in the future, especially his adopted parents, is in fact his own true family, choosing at that very moment seeing his mother to not change history at all, knowing what he can be rather than what could have been. Looking to the future is the only way we would be able to progress further in our lives rather than remembering the past of what it possibly could have brought in our own that could have gone a different way. Something you can't actually change, where in that aspect we can appreciate those who actually choose to do so that we can live a life as much as they would thinking otherwise, moving on from that one moment to the next. And that is the type of storytelling that makes you fall in love with Disney for, the realistic situations of any type in all of our families that are done to achieve our dreams, just like the ghost of Tiana and what her father dreamt of working hard to get a restaurant. We see her in films like this, how his positive attitude contributed to Tiana actually becoming the same hard worker dedicated to opening up that restaurant in the future, and that heart carried on of what was really important the whole time through love, where Eudora also carried that same as her mother and of course his wife, just wanting her daughter to be happy and not work herself to death to achieve such goals about the heart that truly matters, which Naveen actually represents. A film that just shows us that legacy is everything and holds us to who we truly are for the better or worse in the cases of love and achieving our goals, where in this case it once again applies to every generation as we said earlier in Strange World and Encanto. The stuff that has to do with transgenerational trauma in the actions that starts out with the first through third generations, ones that truly represent the greater meaning of family and what Disney storytelling is really all about, being these movies families of all ages can actually enjoy. which sadly is a partial reason why Strange World failed, because it kinda does the same thing in that three-tiered relationship in a much less impactful way that was done in the previous film, like in Encanto. Because here in Encanto, we have the family of Mirabel, where it starts out with its matriarch Alma Madrigal and her 3 kids being Julieta, Pepa, and Bruno, all of which she had with Pedro, who was killed when they were fleeing these attacking forces. From there on, as we know, Julieta and Pepa had children of their own, while Bruno later on hid from the family to keep them safe from his visions, which unfortunately gave the wrong impressions about them and the pressure that Alma actually put upon them with their gifts later on. And honestly, talking about this part would just be me basically talking about the entire movie as a whole, which I want to do so later at another point, where it has so many things to say that makes it a truly great Disney story in the modern age, where you get what it was trying to do to talk about in family and the trauma that is put on ourselves by our own parents and their parents before around everyone, and how that is represented with their magical gifts. Just one of the most relatable movies you could ever see, and appreciate that in the role it actually plays in life, especially for the fact it came out by Disney at a time like this, that even recently as 2021, they always still can prove their worth, that they can be enjoyed, and the reason why they've been here this long above anything else for 100 years or more. In a way, this one actually shows the main points I've talked about in both terms of good and bad, and how Abuela actually represents that figure to a T, being the main source of antagonism while also not being an antagonist or villain itself that most of these stories actually come with. That what she imprinted on as a parent and a grandparent affected the perception people have about them for the perceived better or actually worse in the case of the cracks showing up in the family, and how that allowed them to grow and actually shine as characters. That this is the height of what parents can do that makes a story impactful from beginning to end. Whether it be good or bad, parents are still the most important figures in our lives that shapes where our destinies lie for the future, how we define ourselves, and how we understand the world we actually live in. And of course, above all, how important that love is in our life that we carry beyond the grave and into the unknown. Something that Disney has been so good at doing for most of these stories, the reason why we love it so, and reminding us the important elements and themes that actually come into play, and why again, for the most part, these are family films that appeal to all ages, where you do have to appeal to the adult if these films are going to be watched. But with that said, I want to hear your thoughts about Disney parents. I missed quite a few on this list, wanting to cover the more broader elements of what they actually bring from the very beginning, but there is just clearly more to be said about these other movies that I didn't talk that have parents like Tangled and so forth. Of course, whether it be a big part of the story, or just in the background that affects the entire plot of our films that we love. And beside that, I hope you enjoyed this look at parents. I'm all done, so goodbye.